curious.
I'm curious. I am curious. Curious.
By nature.
We're all getting older, but scientists that study aging have made progress understanding what happens to us later in life and what we can do to stay healthier longer. Everyone wants to know how to keep feeling young. That's what we'll talk about with today's guest. Dr. Miller, welcome. Please introduce yourself and what you do.
Yes, I'm Benjamin Miller. I'm a professor and department head in aging and metabolism at the Oklahoma Medical Research Foundation. We are a private foundation that does research, so a little bit different than a university in that we don't have an undergrad presence here. We only do research.
Tell me about your work.
I study basically what causes us to age. And why our body sort of breaks down over time and how to slow that from happening. And then the other major focus is that I really am focused on muscle specifically. So how we can prevent, this loss of the ability of our muscles to work well as we get older. So both in how much muscle we have and how well it works.
At what age do our muscles start to deteriorate?
Sadly, it's much earlier than we would hope. What's often written down is that this starts happening at about 40 years of age, and then declines over time. Of course, there's ways to slow that down, but if you did nothing, you would start to see losses around that age. Metabolism,
let's say, people think of that and they think about ways that they can maybe be, if their metabolism is working, they're thinner. They don't necessarily think about the maybe metabolism in the way that you study it. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, it is fundamentally the same thing. So, we eat food. That food has to be turned into a usable form of energy. Okay. So, that process starts as soon as we start eating food. And, I don't really work on the digestive aspect of food or anything like that. But once it's absorbed and broken down into these components that you hear a lot about, fats and carbohydrates and proteins, the cells use those in different ways to produce energy, to sustain all the things that the cell needs to do. Proteins are also used to build the structures in our bodies, and that's what I'm particularly interested in our proteins. So any sort of scaffolding or structure, or if you think about a muscle or a heart or a brain, that's all made up of different proteins. So I'm interested in sort of this interaction of how much energy we have affects our ability to make and remodel and break down old things and sustain all these proteins in our body.
What we consume, what we eat or drink, how that changes the proteins and how it contributes to aging, like having a longer health span, basically, or
yeah. And you used the right word there, the health span. So when aging research first started, it was a lot of this fountain of youth type of things and reversing aging, like a Benjamin Button movie or something like that. And, there is a certain small aspect of the aging field that's interested in immortality or living to 150 or 200 years old. And that's not really what we're after. We're after trying to increase this period of good health and not declining. And, metabolism is one of this key, what they call a pillar of the age-related process. We have certain processes in the body that the aging field has really identified as some of the key things that we need to target to slow this aging process down. And one of them is this ability to use energy. So the ability to change what we eat into usable energy. And the other is to maintain proteins in sort of a young-like state. So, as the longer a protein is there, it accumulates damage, and that's, sort of aging. And if we can, sort of get rid of that damage and keep it in a more young-like state, that keeps our whole body young-like.
That's mostly the muscle structure?
it's any structure in the body. I
And-
tend to focus on the muscle,
Mhm.
but it's the heart, it's the liver, it's the brain, it's your skin. We see wrinkles, and that's a failure of maintaining some of those proteins in the skin. So it's everywhere.
Can you tell me more, though, about, I guess, what you find fascinating in your work? What is it that drives you currently?
It's a curiosity, and it's a desire to improve human health. Okay.
Tell me more about the curiosity.
I use an analogy a lot of times with my trainees, that if you're someone that likes to go for a hike and you do an out and back hike, and you're always wondering when to turn around. And I'm the type of person that always just wants to, well, what's around the next corner? What's around the next corner? And I never want to turn around because I always want to know what I might be missing out on, what's around the next corner. And I think that's kind of the same thing with research. It's what's around the next corner. What don't we know yet? What is that next thing we're going to figure out? And there's something really cool about asking questions nobody has asked before, and being able to contribute new knowledge to this body of knowledge. Each individual little discovery is not that big of a deal, but when you put it together with all the other ones, we start to accumulate this body of knowledge that impacts human health.
And is there something now that is your next curiosity that you can share with us, or a previous one?
Yeah, there's a couple things that we're working on. I when I talk about the proteins, I'm really interested in how we might be able to keep those young. Okay, how we can make old proteins look young again. That's one aspect of my work. The other is we're working really hard. So when an older individual goes into the hospital and say they're undergoing bed rest for a period of time, or because they had a surgery, or just because whatever brings them to the hospital, and they have this period of time that they're very immobile, and old people lose muscle, so do young people under those conditions. But after the hospitalization, young people gain it back. Old people do not. And so this is why hospitalization can be very devastating for an older individual, because they'll come back out weaker than when they went in, even if they recovered from whatever took them in there. And so we're working really hard on how can we fix that? How can we make it so that older individuals regain all that muscle mass and how well it worked after they come out of the hospital? And that's something that's really tangible, that if you fixed it or not. When you're working on things related to just basic aging, you don't always know whether this is going to have a positive impact or not, because aging is so hard to measure. But this is something that is going to have it's going to be pretty obvious when we figure out how that works.
And what are some of the things that you are maybe testing or looking at? Is it diet, exercise? Is all of it? Is there something else?
So most of my research focuses on certain compounds or exercise.
Mhm.
And the way I have explained this in the past, is all the compounds or drugs that we're looking at are really trying to be as good as exercise. So we know exercise works for almost all of these things, and works probably better than almost any of these things. But we need an alternative, because not everybody is physically capable of exercising. Not everybody wants to do it. So we have to have alternative means for that. And so that's where some of the drugs come in, or the compounds.
What does it mean, exercise, for someone maybe in their 60s, 70s, or 80s to rebuild that? What does that look like? Right.
And when you ask, like, for an older individual, what does exercise look like? A large proportion of benefits of exercise goes from doing nothing to doing something. Okay. And exercise, there is some discussion, maybe saying exercise is the wrong thing to say, because people view exercise as doing this very purposeful workout where you're sweating and straining and everything else, where in reality what we're talking about is physical activity. So just being active, going for a walk, adding things into your life like stairs rather than elevator, those kinds of things. A lot of those benefits just come from doing something.
What about for younger people? When you said you're looking at how you can keep proteins young, right?
So the key, or what's much easier actually from a treatment perspective, is to prevent people from ever having these things to begin with. Okay. So to reverse the negative outcomes is harder than to prevent them from happening to begin with. So, if we talk about aging and aging well, it's much easier to do the things earlier in life that prolong this period spent in good health. Okay, so you think about things like exercise that extend our period of good health until we have disease. One of our areas of research, we've taken that rationale of trying to extend the period of good health, and we have now started to look at some of these treatments that have been proposed for aging, and we purposely use them in humans or animals, model organisms that are in good health, to see, okay, if someone started taking this drug, why they're already healthy, what will it do? And actually what we have found is that at least one of these drugs that we've used, it actually inhibits some of the positive effects of exercise. So to do exercise and this drug at the same time might not be the greatest idea. So that is an area that of great interest to us. What are because if someone's healthy and they're interested in good health, they're most often doing more than one thing to affect their health. It's not like they eat well, but the rest of their life they're doing all kinds of harmful things to their body. Usually they have a healthy lifestyle. So we're trying to figure out what are some of these things that work well together, so that we're not doing one thing that inhibits the good effects of another thing.
Right. Have you looked at the effects of the obesity or diabetes drug on proteins?
Yes. So metformin is the one we've been looking at most. And we have 2 or 3 different experiments, one of them in humans, trying to figure out why is it that metformin seems to not. So metformin works great if you're diabetic, and it works great if you have prediabetes. And if you're metabolically unhealthy, metformin is great. We're testing whether it is so good for people that are already healthy. And we don't think it's as good for people that are already healthy.
Because
So
there has been some talk about an anti-aging benefits of metformin, right?
Right. Yeah. And I've been a little bit to the contrary, or cautious, I should say, of, broadly saying metformin is good for everybody.
Right. Yes, that makes sense. And what about the more Ozempic type of drugs?
So this is an interesting area for someone who studies muscle, because a known effect of those drugs, you have this massive loss in fat mass, but a lot of people are losing muscle mass as well. So I've tried to have some discussions with MD colleagues that may see patients in the clinic, and some of them are prescribing these types of drugs because they're very good at getting diabetes under control. Okay.
Right.
And they're less concerned, if their mindset is, if I can get these diabetes under control, this is a good thing, and then we can work from there. But I worry about some of the older people, and when I say older, 70 to 80-year-olds, that might also be losing a large amount of muscle mass because they're in a compromised state with muscle mass already. So I recently met with a 84-year-old gentleman who wanted to know, because he's on these drugs and he knew that he had also just lost like 10 to 15 pounds of muscle, and he was not very big to begin with. He was on this drug to help control his diabetes. And he's like, what am I supposed to do about my muscle that I'm losing? And I told him, I'm like, unfortunately, we don't know yet. But there are some drug companies that have really have recognized this, have latched onto it, and they're looking at some of these drugs that you could take at the same time to try to preserve muscle mass.
What would you say, what's coming up in the future, maybe in the short term and longer term future?
So it's an exciting time to be in aging research, because it has such there's a growing interest in it, and that's for a couple reasons. One is this concept called geroscience. It was a term that came out of the National Institute on Health, where a group came together, and it's this idea that aging is the number one risk factor for almost all chronic diseases. So diabetes, heart disease, COPD, Alzheimer's. So if all of those things increase with age, and age is their biggest risk factor, if we could somehow slow the aging process, we would simultaneously treat all those diseases at the same time rather than one at a time. And so that created a lot of momentum around aging research. And I think that makes it exciting.
Are there any questions that you'd like to, that I haven't asked you, that maybe you'd like to be able to comment on?
I think it's important for people to understand the scientific process, how this happens. Rarely in science do you have these eureka moments where it just changes everything, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that we're all gradually making these small contributions that when you look at one of them at a time, they can be confusing, like this one said this one and this one said this one. But when you get that body of knowledge as a whole, you start to see things emerge. And that takes time, and it's a process. And people who are not patient or okay with delayed gratification should not go into science. You will never be satisfied. I mean, you just have to take this. It's a slow process. It's one at a time. It's contributions, but in the end, if you look at where we are now compared to where, it's like, you have to look at the big picture to see how much things have actually changed. So I think that's always an important point for the public to remember.
Curious by Nature is a production of Newswise. More than 7,000 journalists get the Newswise wires. Visit newswise.com and find out how to spread your news today.